Good afternoon, BookTube. It's Tony here from Logs to Reads. Happy New Year. I am recording this because I wanted to give an update on some of the projects that I'm planning for 2025 and look at what I've been reading recently. I've read a shed load of Doctor Who novels. I don't want to talk about those for the moment because this channel isn't really a Doctor Who channel. But I might do a separate video at some point on Doctor Who books, maybe books I would recommend, but that's not for now. But I've also been starting my 2025 plans that I outlined in the previous video. I started some of them in December. So I have my birthday plan. That's my birthday this weekend. I intend to try and get quite drunk at some point over the weekend, and I'm seeing lots of friends, so I'm really looking forward to that. But one of the projects I started was to read a book from each year since I was born, which is going back to the early 70s. Now I started off with T.J. Bass's Half Past Human, which is a science fiction novel. It's a SF Masterworks. I think it's a duology with another book called God Whale. It's basically set in the far future where humanity has become, well, it's evolved into like a four-toed, hive-dwelling, socially divided race, whose overall sort of target's life is managed by what I kind of think is an AI, and everything is planned, and down to who gets to have children, who doesn't. But there's also some they're four-toed, but they're also surviving remnants of five-toed humanity, who are basically hunted. They live outside the big cities, or the big city. It's almost like one big mega city from the way I understand it, and they're hunted by and cannibalized, and the hunters are sometimes killed by the five-toed people and eaten as well. It's an interesting sort of clash of cultures, and it's the story sort of it's told from a number of points of view. It's a really good book. I really enjoyed reading it. Downside, it's slightly sort of, it's like female women in these stories are just breeding objects for breeding. There's no real attempt to put a female side of things. And I use female there because that's how it feels. It's one of those phrase. Sometimes I think using the word female just sounds wrong. It sounds cold and odd, and a bit and the wrong thing to say. But I think it fits with this book. And sexual assault is considered just a sad bystander. It's not a crime as such. And I saw where the story was going from about the halfway point, and I don't want to say anything much more about it just to avoid spoiling it. It did remind me of Blood Music by Greg Bear, sort of indirectly. Hot House by Brian Aldiss, and the Arthur C. Clarke book, Childhood's End. Sort of reminded me of those. Really enjoyed it, and that's the first book. So I read that in December, and that's 1971 ticked off. And then I started working on my project, which I'm currently calling From the Epic of Gilgamesh to However Far I Get Before I Die, but it needs a better title than that. So there's no prizes for coming up with one that works. So I started by rereading the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is actually the third time I've read this, but as it's a quite short little book, it's not hard. You can see there's a lot of tags there. That's the introduction, because there's a lot of information in the introduction. This is the Penguin Classics one, obviously. translated with introduction and notes by N.K. Sandars. It was first published in 1960, so this is quite an old translation. I don't know if I would like to read a more modern not modern, a different translation, because I from his introduction, not all of the Epic of Gilgamesh is in here. I think he left some things out. It does have the thing it's most famous for, which is the flood story, and that's sort of a parallel to the biblical flood story. Although in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they decide to wipe humanity out because humanity is noisy and the gods can't sleep, and humans only survive because the gods, or some of the gods, suddenly realize that maybe they're going a bit far. So yeah, it's a really good book. I would like to. Might do a separate video on the Epic of Gilgamesh and some of the stuff around it in the future. I want to read more because I don't actually know much about the history of the cultures this book is drawn from. So yeah, but I really enjoyed it. It's so easy to read. I really recommend it, and it's in recent years there's been a lot of literature drawn from it, in that fashion for retellings that we've recently come across, and it also is the background for one of the worst Doctor Who novels ever written. But I said I wasn't going to talk about Doctor Who. Yeah, recommended. I really do recommend this as a start, and this translation is really easy and straightforward. Then I moved on to ancient Egypt. Now I have two separate books here. We've got the Penguin Classics Writings from Ancient Egypt, and we've got the Oxford World Classics, the Tales of, I think it's pronounced Sinuhe or Sinuhe. This is tales and all from the Middle Kingdom. It's and the Tale of Sinuhe is the longest thing in it. It's very good actually, and it reads like it's fictional, but it reads like a genuine autobiography from the time that would have been carved on somebody's tomb. So I reread that. I mean, these are rereads for these ones. This is by R.B. Parkison. With it, they do the introduction and notes. There is some crossover between these two books. I actually marked up. I don't know if you can see that, but I actually marked up where it's got a star. That's when it crosses over with this, and there's a little note there which I haven't thing. So yeah, I've reread that, and I've started rereading this. This is a slightly broader selection. It's from all periods of Egyptian history, and it's a collection. It doesn't just include tales; it includes like accounts of battles, natural disasters. There's obelisk inscriptions, mortuary spells, funeral hymns, songs, advice on life. It spans 2,000 years of Egyptian culture, and it's a good introduction to Egyptian literature. With as with a lot of ancient literature, we've no idea really how much we've survived and how much is lost. You've got to assume that the majority of what stuff was lost, although there are occasional discoveries. But yeah, but they're both a good insight into Egyptian culture. The next book on the Egyptian list before I move on to ancient Greece is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Now I'm aware that isn't actually a narrative. That's not a story. I think if I remember rightly, a collection of like spells. It's a spell book and a sort of funeral guide book. It's a big chunky book. So that will be what I read once I've reread these, and then I might do and there's some other books I've got on ancient Egypt that I've read or I'm in the process of reading. So at some point I'll do ancient Egypt one-off video. He says, promising something he probably won't deliver on. I will try. And the other thing that I'm kind of parallel reading is William Langland, Piers Plowman. This is a 14th century. I'm saying that with absolute confidence. It's Middle English allegorical poem. It's just done as a sort of religious vision. It was originally obviously written in Middle English, and this is a prose translation of a poem. It's an interesting story so far. I'm about, I'd say, halfway through it, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. There's 2 bookmarks because that's notes page. It's, I kind of think allegorical writing, like, we've kind of lost as a thing. A bit like epic poetry. You don't get much epic poetry anymore. You don't get many allegorical stories either. And it's fascinating to read. You can see actually, I think, in that. I'm basing this on limited knowledge, on some of the seeds for the issues that will become the Reformation, Protestantism, Lollardism, that kind of thing, especially in terms of arguments about the corruption and ignorance of the clergy, and society's focus on money and Greek and lust and blah blah blah. But it's actually quite a fun read so far. It's not the easiest of reads because you are constantly having to work your way through. It's a bit like the Divine Comedy, in that there's so much of it is dependent on kind of knowledge of that as a person from that era you would probably have without even having to worry about it. Particularly, like, for example, passages from the Bible. And as I've said before, to understand a lot of Western literature, reading the Bible is kind of is a key that unlocks a lot of doors. Now, I've got that prose translation, but I also use my Christmas money, and this is madness, but it was free. Christmas money is free money, so as far as I'm concerned, it's a freebie. I bought the Norton critical edition of Piers Plowman as well, translated by Italo Donaldson. I'm not that familiar with Norton critical editions, but I really like how these are structured. This one, the reason I bought this one is because it's it's got the original Middle English on this side, and then the translation, but it's also a poetic translation of a poem. And my plan, what I'd like to do, I've got a slightly bent page there. What I'd like to do with in the future with books like this when I'm working on them, and it means I'm probably going to read less, but that's not a bad thing because I read too quickly a lot of the time, and I don't take it. It gets absorbed and it eventually sort of mushes into things. But I like to think more about what I'm reading. This is a particularly the plan is to if I get something like this is to read it through without looking at notes or looking up things unless I feel it's absolutely essential for my understanding of what I'm reading. Then when I get to the end, go back to those things that I've highlighted as with question marks, with like, what does this mean, blah blah. Read the notes, and then read it again. And if it's a translated document, in a different translation, and then sort of get some understand. And hopefully that process it doubles the time you're spending reading a single book. And to a lot of people out there, reading Piers Plowman twice in depth when there's no purpose to it apart from educational enjoyment might seem mad, but I kind of have reached the point in my life where I think just read what you want to read when you want to read it, and if I want to try and if I want to do this project of reading the canon from an Epic of Gilgamesh to however far I get before I die, then that's my thing. And if people are interested in it with me, great. If you're not, I'm sorry, but that's what's happening. I'm obviously reading other things, but I keep getting distracted by things that I see on BookTube or things that I whatever. Like for example, at the moment, I'm really fascinated. I really want to read some more Anglo-Saxon stuff and stuff about the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, that period of English history. I was watching the channel. I can't remember the name of the woman's channel it was. She writes fantasy and historic fantasy based on historical stuff, especially the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. And there was a video she did about she did a video with a writer about Anglo-Saxon women. I'll put a link down in the show notes when I remember who. I'll look up who it is. My apologies to the person concerned for not remembering her name. And I do want to read one of her books now because of that video. So yeah, it's I'd like to do it in. The plan is to do this in order, as I said, from the Epic of Gilgamesh onwards. But there's part of me that thinks actually, for example, I've agreed. I'm doing a buddy read of the Tale of Genji, which is obviously, as those who know, is a big, chunky book. It's an 11th century Japanese novel. And that's going to slot into quarter 1. And that's completely out. It's in the canon list, but it's outside the doing it in order. Sorry about that. So I think that's probably going to happen inevitably. But yes, so that's where I am with my reading. There are a couple of other things that I'm reading. My reading group are going to be reading this as our next book, which I'm really looking forward to. I've meant to read this for years. I've meant to read some Italo Calvino, different stuff for yonks, but this is on my list, so they'll be reading this in January, February. And I think that's about it in terms of an update. I have been reading some of the books, some of the translated books that is on the Goodreads list for potential international booker reads, which has been interesting so far. I think I've only read 3 of them. One of them definitely won't be on the international bookish long list, but I will talk about those at some other point. Yeah, so that's it. I'm trying to. I still haven't worked out a good way to end these videos. It doesn't involve me waffling on for a long time like I'm doing now. So let's call it a day. Have a good weekend coming up shortly. As I said, I want to be drunk for as much of it as is humanly possible. And look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks very much. Bye bye.